There are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are differences of ministries, but the same Lord. Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley. This video is the second in a series of past pastors of what's now Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley, talking about a number of the more notable men who have been pastor at the church. And in this video I want to talk about this gentleman. There we go, the Reverend Robert Macbeth. As his name suggests, he was a Scotsman. He came from Caithness. He was the pastor at what was then Hope Chapel, Shelton, because the boundaries between Hanley and Shelton have moved around a bit. And he was pastor between 1845 and 1851. Now, a lot of the information I'm giving comes from this book, A History of the Broadway Congregational Church, Hammersmith. I'll get on to his ministry at the Broadway in a while. He was there for 40 years, so it was a significant part, the most significant part of his life. Now, he was born in 1816 at Wick, Caithness. His father was an engineer. It's been said that the Scots have produced some of the best engineers in the world. And old Mr. Macbeth was a deacon of the Congregational Church at Wick. He was an engineer who was involved in the construction of the old harbour there. And he was a farmer. So he was a man who kept a farm as well as being this engineer. He was a canny, thrifty Scotsman. He was a man who was concerned that his sons make the best way they could in their lives, and so he insisted that, as well as helping out on the farm, each of his sons had to learn a trade, rather like the practice that existed among the ancient Jews. That's why the Apostle Paul, of course, was a tent maker. He was a rabbi when he was Saul of Tarsus, but he was also a tent maker. He learned to support himself working with his hands. The same was true of Robert Macbeth. He learned to be a cabinet builder. That is somebody, of course, who builds furniture. However, that wasn't the career that he was to follow. Brought up in the fear and admonition of the Lord, brought up in the old Congregational Church at Wick, he was converted, and he began to feel that he was called to the ministry. The church tested him, and they decided that he was indeed called to the ministry, and they sent him for training to one of the theological colleges that existed at the time in Britain. Surprisingly, because the Scottish Congregational churches did have their own theological college, they sent him not to a college in Edinburgh, but to a college further south in Blackburn in Lancashire. Blackburn today still feels very much like an old industrial town. At the time it had many churches, many chapels, one of which was a significant Congregational church. And it also had a theological college. When we look at the positioning of theological colleges in England at the time, sometimes it can seem a bit odd, because a lot of it was about, you'd have certain learned ministers who would train men for the ministry. That would be one of the ways that they would support themselves, in addition to the money that they were paid by the congregation, the support they got from them. And what this meant was that you could find a theological college in a small town. Of course, one of the best known of that kind of colleges was that in Northampton that was kept by Philip Doddridge, and that then moved to Daventry and a couple of other places before ending up being based in the London area. Well, Blackburn Academy was one of them. At the time, the principal, the minister in charge, was a man called Mr. Wardlaw. But when Robert Macbeth went to Blackburn in 1841, Mr. Wardlaw was getting old, and more importantly, his eyesight was failing. In those days, there was no braille or anything like that, and as his eyesight failed, reading, of course, became something that he found more and more difficult to do. It reached a point where he was thinking about retiring, they were talking about moving the college somewhere else, and there came a point where the senior students were effectively teaching the younger ones. Well, it couldn't carry on. Eventually he did retire, but by this point arrangements had been made to continue the college in a location nearer to Manchester, Whalley Range. A massive new building was constructed, the Lancashire Independent College. The building's still there, although it's not a theological college anymore. It was a modern college. It wasn't anymore this model of having a local pastor who would have various students, perhaps half a dozen to a dozen every year, who would board locally, and perhaps there'd be a dedicated college building, or perhaps they'd hold lectures in the chapel where he was pastor. That model passed away and was replaced by a model where you had a dedicated college staff. You had professors who would teach the various subjects, theology, of course, New Testament, Old Testament, Hebrew, ecclesiastical history, apologetics, homiletics, that is the art of preaching, for want of a better way of putting it. And the Lancashire College was one of these new style seminaries, theological colleges. Robert Macbeth remained there from 1843, when the college opened, until 1845, when his course ended. And of course, as happens today in theological colleges, they would send out the students to preach, and churches that were looking for ministers would approach the college and say, could you send some of your students to preach? Then as now, a lot of churches said, we'd actually like a man with some pastoral experience. But the thing is, of course, if everyone wants a man with some pastoral experience, you end up with nobody having pastoral experience, because people die and students have to do something. And not every church, in fact a vast majority of churches, can't do an assistantship. They just don't have the resources. And the same was true then. Well, Hope Chapel was looking for a new pastor. The old pastor had retired, and a new man was needed. The man they chose, who would have been, I suspect, one of the students who had been sent down to preach, the man they chose was Robert Macbeth. And we don't know a lot about his time in Hanley for a variety of reasons, one of which is simply that the records disappeared. But we do know that he took a full part in the life of the church, of course, but also was involved in wider causes. One of them was that of disestablishment of the Church of England. He was a speaker at what was then called the Anti-State Church Society, what eventually became known as the Liberation Society. The thing was, it wasn't made up of people who wanted themselves to be liberated from the establishment, but it was made up of people who wanted to forcibly liberate the establishment. It was not very popular among Anglicans. It was seen, and I think really quite rightly, as a nonconformist club of people who wanted to disestablish the C of E. On a happier note, he married while he was at Hope. He married in 1849 a woman called Mary Cotton from Congleton. She was a member, her father was a member of the Independent Chapel in Congleton, what's now the URC, although of course the building that they met in those days is now the Freemasons building, the Masonic Hall. But back then, actually the only reason Masonic Hall is because they sold it when they built a new one. And Mrs. Macbeth, of course, would have been quite a contrast to her husband. She was a Staffordshire lady. He was this Scotsman, this Highlander. Well, the pastorate seems to have gone well, but in 1851 he was called to a church in Darlington. Well, he didn't stay very long, because in 1853 he received a call from the Broadway Congregational Church in Hammersmith. The Broadway Church was one of these chapels that had been established by Puritans who had been thrown out of the Church of England in 1662. It had actually been established as a Presbyterian church, the same sort of church as Matthew Henry, for example. He was a Presbyterian. But English Presbyterianism in the 18th century went into a serious decline, and it was a theological decline. It was a theological decline in which many of the leading congregations, including that in Newcastle under Lyme, became Unitarian. They abandoned belief in the Trinity. But not all of them did. However, the Presbyterian organisation, which had never really existed since the days of the Commonwealth, what little was left of it broke apart. And so what was left? Well, chapels that didn't become Unitarian became Congregationalists. That's what happened in Congleton, for example. Not in Congleton, rather. Congleton indeed had a Unitarian chapel. No, in Leek. I'm thinking about Leek. In Leek, the chapel began to go Unitarian, but the minister was kicked out, and the church then became independent, Congregational. Now, the Hammersmith Broadway Chapel had had a number of problems in its history. It had struggled in those recent years, and in 1853 the church was, as many people, including the deacons, thought, on its last legs. They couldn't really see a way the church could continue, but they said, we'll have one more go. We'll call this man Robert Macbeth from Darlington. We've heard about him. We've heard that he's a good pastor, a good preacher, and we'll see if, with his help, we can keep the church going. And so they called him. And to read from the history by the Right Honourable Sir William Ball, Baronet, and this history was published in 1923, he says, the disheartened elders of the church seriously consider the advisability of closing it down and paying off the debt. But a brighter day dawned when the Reverend Robert Macbeth accepted the pastorate, and his powerful personality and earnest eloquence soon filled the church. In 10 years, the number of the congregation had increased to such an extent that it was found necessary to build a larger church next door to the old one, and in 1863 it was duly opened. It was a remarkable change that the church had gone from a situation where they thought, given just a few years, we should close. There's a picture of the interior of the old chapel here. This is shortly before it was demolished, actually, and so it's in quite a state. It was used as the Sunday school hall, but you can see an old-fashioned chapel with a gallery at the back. And that was where Robert Macbeth began his ministry in Hammersmith in 1843. He continued there until his death in January 1899, after a very short illness. And one of the things that Ball does with this history is he interviewed people who had been members, who had attended the church, and asked them about their experiences. So these are some recollections from Sir Edwin Cornwall. In those days, the central figure was Reverend Robert Macbeth, and one cannot imagine a finer type of a real, genuine Scots nonconformist divine. He was always beloved, respected, and admired by those who were privileged to know him. Although a very learned man, he would perhaps not be considered a great preacher, but seemed to prefer simple religious Bible teaching applied consistently and reverently. The permanent result of such a ministry cannot be measured. That it has been great, I have no doubt. He was a man with great learning, but he wasn't a man who paraded his learning. He was a man whose learning was undergirding everything that he did, but a man who sought to preach a simple gospel. And in that sense, he's a man who represents the tradition that the Bethel is in. We want to present a simple gospel, not something that is intellectual only, but at the same time, we don't want to be ignorant or anti-intellectual, rather to preach the word, to teach the Bible as it is. More notes from Mr. Peck this time, Mr. Peck, and he says, my earliest impression of Mr. Macbeth's ministry was its solemnity. The good old Scottish formula, let us worship God, with which he prefaced all his services, seemed to indicate so plainly that he had entered the holy place and was inviting his hearers to do the same. I have heard the same words used by many ministers in many places since, but never, I think, with quite the same effect on me. This is somebody who sat on his ministry as a boy. Then as years went on, one became impressed by his profound scholarship. He had a wide acquaintance with the literature of Europe, classical and modern, and by his exact knowledge of the Scriptures, which he was able to study in the Hebrew and Greek in which they were originally written. To many of us, the Bible became a new, vital book, the teaching and laws whereof were of unique applicability to every phase and circumstance for everyday life, and to be disregarded at the infinite loss and peril not only of the individual, but of the nation and of the soul. He was a man who contended against godless socialism and atheism. A man who, brought up as he was in that Scottish self-reliance background, challenged the local socialists to a debate, preparing and circulating a series of theses, arguing that the adoption of a socialistic form of government by mankind would inevitably lead to confiscation and libertinage. His argument basically was that socialism leads to communism. He didn't charge this upon his opponents. He didn't say, you're really just pretending to be communists. He said, this is where I think that your position leads. The debate developed rather stormily. The Fabians got angry and were, of course, quite unconverted. But the impression left on one at least of the audience, it was a fine thing for a man to be able to uphold the cause of righteousness and point the more excellent way, as Mr. Macbeth did that night. He knew many notable people. One of them was George MacDonald, the somewhat strange Scottish Congregational novelist who was such an influence upon C.S. Lewis. He knew also more orthodox men, such as Dr. Staunton, the nonconformist divine of Kensington, Reverend William Hanna, the son-in-law and biographer of Thomas Chalmers, Dr. Alexander Raleigh, who was one of his friends at college and also became a noted man in the denomination. He was very concerned for the welfare of the young, of young men, and not only young men, but also young women and children. He was the kind of man who was noted for being willing to even help a little child with a little girl with her homework one day. Frederick Peck notes, in rereading this letter, I note that I've only referred to the more public side of Mr. Macbeth's ministry. It had another side, quite as efficient and kindly, but as I can only speak of it as it affected myself and those near and dear to me, it would be irrelevant to refer to it here. Incidentally, I may say that I have seen him at one time busily engaged repairing a broken magic lantern for the Sunday scholars, the old-fashioned projectors. And another helping it'll go with a homework arithmetic. And in times of real trouble, I never met anyone who could make you feel as he could, that whatever sorrow, the everlasting arms were about you. He was an old-fashioned Scottish divine. And he was the old-fashioned Scottish divine theologian at his best. A man who was humble. A man who taught the people who heard him gladly. A man who saw the practical social implications of Christianity. And the reason why he could oppose the socialists as he did was because he felt that they were bringing the wrong answer to the real problems that London, and of course what we now think of as Greater London, including Hammersmith, but that Britain was facing problems of poverty, problems of suffering, and problems that are answered ultimately by the application of the Word of God to the soul and to society. So Robert Macbeth, 1816 to 1899, pastor at Hanley for 5 years and a bit, pastor at Hammersmith for 40 years, a man of great ability, a man of great humility, the sort of man that holds office. He was chairman of the London Congregational Union, but the sort of man who is eventually in some sense forgotten. He served his generation by the will of God and fell on sleep, even as King David did. May we serve our generation, but also give thanks for those who have gone before, those who have paved the way, those who have carried the torch and then handed it on to us. Well, thank you for watching. May God bless you and keep you, and may God direct all our hearts unto him. And when we come to worship, let us remember indeed that we come, as Robert Macbeth said, to worship God.